Good morning, everyone. I think I can still say Kong Hei Fat Choi, and a very, very happy Chinese New Year, and a very warm welcome to the third episode of the Policy Dialogue, jointly organized by the Department of Asian and Policy Studies, the Academy of Hong Kong Studies in the Education University of Hong Kong, as well as the Division of Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. So my name is Isabella Wong. I am the Assistant Professor and Associate Head Teaching and Learning in the Department of Asian and Policy Studies. And I'm the moderator for today's series. So as always, the Policy Dialogue series is hosted by Professor Anthony CHEUNG, a well-known figure and a public policy titan in Hong Kong. And each episode focuses on a particular issue. At each time, we will invite experts and luminaries to share their thoughts and critically engage in analyzing and discussing the issue. And today we are going to look at one issue being considered as a chronic problem in a territory, housing in Hong Kong. So we're going to investigate and look at whether we could really solve this problem as it has been here for ages. And what are the dynamics and challenges to confront and attempt to solve this issue? Could we learn from any major cities in Asia, like Singapore has been famous for having a great housing affordability in Asia? And at the end, could this be solved? And so today we have the pleasure of having two renowned experts on policy issues, particularly on housing, to be with us. We are very, very excited to have Professor Donald Low here and Dr. Stephen Wong among us. So Professor Low is Director of Hong Kong USD Institute for Emerging Market Studies, Professor of Practice at the Hong Kong USD Institute for Public Policy, as well as Director of Leadership and Public Policy Executive Education at the Hong Kong UST. He's an accomplished consultant and lecturer in economics and behavioral economics, decision-making and risk analysis, and equality and social policy, complexity in public policy, organizational behavior, and the politics and governance of Singapore. And joining us as well is Dr. Stephen Wong, who is the Senior Vice President of our Hong Kong Foundation, and also the Executive Director of the Foundation's Public Policy Institute. He's also a Legislative Council member for the HKSARG. Needless to say, we have Anthony, who has always been very supportive to the department, has ever been so kind to host this seminar for many years now. Anthony is the Research Chair Professor of Public Policy in our department and Adjunct Chair Professor of Hong Kong UST. He was the former president of our university and the Secretary for Transport and Housing. So what we're going to do today is we're going to have the speakers to have 20 to 25 minutes to present the arguments, and then after that, we'll then send you the reminders through the chat box if the time is up, and then we will then allow the floor to ask questions. So for those who have joined the Zoom, and also for those who are on Facebook Live, you're very welcome to send us questions and comments either through the chat box on the Zoom or through the PM us, or through the comments on the Facebook Live. So without further delay, could we have Anthony to start first? Anthony, please.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Isabella, for your kind introduction. Today, of course, fighting the COVID-19 pandemic is the #1 question. As what President Xi Jinping said, it overrides everything. But for Hong Kong as a whole, over the last many years, housing has been our #1 social problem. So I think looking at the housing issue probably is as important as fighting the pandemic in the longer run. So let me first share the screen with the audience. Okay. Okay, I guess everybody can see the screen. So today's topic is housing affordability, a land, planning, or political question. It's really a combination of different aspects of the matter. Now, back last year, July, the director of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office of the State Council, Mr. Shao Baolong, and he said, when reviewing the Hong Kong situation, he said, he hoped that we can get rid of subdivided units and cage homes. Now that, of course, is what everybody in Hong Kong would like to see. And that has been Hong Kong's aspiration, so to speak. But the matter is very complicated, as we all know, because it has been bothering us for so many years. Now let's look at the statistics. This is the trend of private domestic price indices, according to the Rating and Valuation Department figures. Now, ever since around 2005 or 6 or 7, the prices in Hong Kong, housing prices, have been on the upward trend. So we have been on this upward trend for more than a decade. The same in terms of rent levels. Although over the last couple of years, the rental level has stayed more or less stable, but still at a very high level. So that's why people in Hong Kong increasingly feel that housing is a great burden. Now, if you look at the supply, the demand and supply situation, these are some of the indicators. It just gives us a sense of the seriousness of the issue. In terms of public rental housing, we have a long queue applying for public housing. The total number of applications as at September last year was over 254,000. And then of those applications, about 100,000 were from non-elderly one-person applicants who were under a different scheme, what we call the quota and points scheme. In terms of average waiting time for public housing, it's now gone up to 5.9 years for those on the general application list, because the quota and point system applicants, they are not sort of given any such indicator or objective. Now, I remember when I first started my term as Secretary for Transport Housing, that was in mid-2012. At that time, we were still able to keep average waiting time, the first time allocation of units to applicants, to less than 3 years. Of course, because of the delay in construction, because of a lack of supply, therefore, the waiting time has gone up. Now, in terms of people living in inadequately accommodated households, about more than 127,000 were living in such households, were living in such accommodation. And of those people, about 90,000 households are living in subdivided flats, tongfang. Now, these give us a sense of the demand for housing, particularly public housing. In terms of supply, according to the government's latest figure, the need would be around 430,000 over the next 10 years. And based on the 70-30 split, public housing supply would be, the target will be over 300,000 units. But that is the objective, the supply target. But whether or not we are able to deliver depends a lot on whether we can get enough land for housing, and also at what time, because that affects the number each year. Now, Hong Kong is rated according to Demographia, because Demographia does an annual housing affordability survey. And Hong Kong right now is ranked as the world's least affordable housing market. And that has been the case for several years. So an indication of how difficult it is for Hong Kong, if you look at the medium multiple figure. Now, 20.7 is the figure for Hong Kong. And that means that housing prices in Hong Kong are roughly 20.7 times the annual median household income. In other words, you don't eat, you don't spend anything for over 20 years. Only then can you afford the median house price. And if you look at other markets, although other markets are experiencing also increasing pressure in terms of affordability, but they are not as terrible as Hong Kong. If you look at the cities, then Vancouver is behind Hong Kong, Sydney, Auckland, Toronto, Melbourne, and so on and so forth. So Hong Kong is not the only city undergoing the housing pressure, but we are slightly worse than others. When we look at real estate bubble, because UBS does an annual global real estate bubble index, and according to the latest index, there are several cities recording double-digit price growth. And Hong Kong, of course, is one of them. And then you have Moscow, Stockholm, Sydney, Tokyo, Vancouver. And European markets are still hot, according to that annual report. Imbalances are sky high. And of course, such pressure creates a lot of implications for the living standard of the population. Lack of affordability of home ownership has evidently not been an obstacle to price increases. So that illustrates the paradox or dilemma we are in. So Hong Kong is not alone. The point I'm trying to make here, but Hong Kong is worse than others because of our unique circumstances in terms of supply and in terms of the firm demand for housing. And if you look at the last few decades, according to Demographia, until the late 1980s or 1990s, national price to income ratios were around 3.0 in many countries, including Australia, UK, and the US. However, since that time, housing affordability has deteriorated very significantly. And by 2019, national median multiples had increased to 4.0 in US, 6.0 in Australia, 7.0 in New Zealand. Hong Kong, of course, is worse. And for those markets with more severe housing supply constraints, the rising inequality is seen to be associated with increased housing values. So that means that it's not just housing, but the impact of housing affordability or the lack of it has affected other aspects of inequality. This is from an OECD report a couple of years ago, and it looked at the European Union. And the comment was housing prices had increased dramatically in OECD countries over the past decade. And people spent on average 22% of their disposable income on housing costs. And nearly 1 in 3 low-income renters spend over 40% of their income on housing. So this is not a small percentage, 40% of your income on housing for those people who rent. And for young people, families with children and seniors, elderly people, finding affordability, affordable housing is a growing challenge. And this is, I think, a similar problem in Hong Kong, maybe more serious for some sections of the population. And because of that, because of the rise in house prices, it's very difficult for people, especially young people, to get on the poverty ladder. And that accounts for part of the reason for growing frustration among the younger generation. So much about the overall world scene. Now, looking back at Hong Kong, I have several observations. Housing is all a matter of supply and demand. And our housing affordability crisis is caused by severe supply shortage vis-a-vis very solid demand. Very solid in terms of both user demand and investment demand. We may be an income inequality could be quite serious in Hong Kong, but there is money within Hong Kong. So there is strong investment demand for housing. So in dealing with the housing problem, we have to deal with both the supply side and the demand side issues. And we must also aim at shifting market expectations, because people buy, they have more urge to buy when prices go up. And funny enough, when prices go down, there's less demand because people look at the future. So unless they see that into the future, prices will come down or prices will not go up that drastically, then they will stop buying, particularly in terms of investment. And of course, in terms of investment, it also depends on the global financial situation. But Hong Kong cannot control the external economic and financial environment. Right now, credit is very cheap, especially since the outbreak of the pandemic. Every country, major economy in the world has been relaxing on credit, zero or even negative interest rate. QE, quantitative easing, has been a policy adopted in many economies. Even, of course, now some countries are trying to allow interest rate to go up slightly, but we have to see the eventual outcome. Domestically, housing demand has been very solid. In terms of land, only 7% of land in Hong Kong is used for residential purpose. So on the surface, it would seem that, well, we only have 7% of our land used for residential purpose. So why can't we increase the amount of land for housing? But we cannot increase land supply quickly and significantly. So why? And how do we deal with the near to medium term demand? Because some plans for increasing land take time. So therefore, can we afford not to give up rezoning land that can immediately be available subject to certain planning adjustments? The planning process is quite lengthy with various studies and separate gazettal procedures and multiple departments involved, which may create hurdles and encourage disagreements. So can that process be streamlined? In Hong Kong, we have to spend time on public engagement and local consultations, which unfortunately amplify instead of narrow differences most of the time. So the question is, can we make those consultation engagement exercises more efficient? How do we deal with rising local NIMBYism, which is something not just in Hong Kong, but in many other cities? In terms of building time and labor supply, are there any problems? We have to distinguish facts from myths, assumptions, presumptions. And then overall, oftentimes narrow-sighted politics have compounded supply difficulties. So can government's capacity be increased, enhanced to bring the public on side? How can we foster whole society consensus and determination? But then, as the Bible says, the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak, oftentimes. So much about the challenges to housing. the need to overcome the land constraint. But how land issue is not just the amount of land available. What we really mean is land use, land that can be used for a particular purpose, in this case, housing. And there are many ways of looking at the land issue in other cities as well. And here I have two quotes, one from Scott Baer, and his article with the title, "The Myth of the Land Constrained City." The point he was trying to make is, well, it's not just the constraint in land, but the constraints against new housing are political, not geographical. When there is a will, there is a way, so to speak. So we can tear down low intensity uses and build higher. So it's all a geographical arrangement or rearrangement, but it depends on whether we can sort out the politics surrounding the controversies involved. And an urban economist, Richard Florida, when he commented on the US situation in his article in 2016, Blame Geography for High Housing Prices, he made a point, which is valid in a general sense. He said affordability is a matter of being an expensive PAN. In other words, are we able to expand our city? Are we able to have easy traveling, convenient traveling, so that people can live further from the center where prices tend to be very high, versus a more congested, maybe more compact city, which used to be, which is bound to be more expensive, PEN, in terms of prices, in terms of rent. So that is a paradox, a dilemma faced worldwide. So it's not just a Hong Kong problem. But of course, in Hong Kong, because of the unique difficulties in land supply and also planning our planning system, our demand situation, we have very unique challenges. When I was secretary, I used to say that for Hong Kong, the housing land issue can be summarized by one figure, the 1% problem. In other words, right now we have 7% of our land used for residential purpose. Can we get another 1%? If we can get that 1%, we can be much better off. And this is the message conveyed by the previous chief executive, C.Y. Leung. Now, in the current administration, in 2018, a task force set up by the current administration on land supply came up with some recommendations, options for short to medium term in finding land, and also options for the medium to long term. Now, I won't go into the detail, you can see from the slide, but actually these options are not new options. They have been around at least for more than a decade in Hong Kong. So they're quite common when we look at them. And there are new plans coming up as well. The most notable initiatives are two: the Land Town Tomorrow vision, announced by the chief executive a few years ago, with the aim of getting reclamation to get over almost 1,700 hectares of land. And that will provide 260,000 to 400,000 housing units. Most of them, 70%, will be public housing. And then the latest initiative announced by the CE November last year on the Northern Metropolis development. Now you can go to those plans for details. For the Northern Metropolis development, it's not just about housing. It's a grander scheme involving Hong Kong's link collaboration with Shenzhen. But the entire Northern Metropolis, if eventualized, could accommodate a residential population of about 2.5 million, and also provide jobs for 650,000 people. Now that is a total objective, but the increase is about 350,000 housing units. Now, in terms of planning, Hong Kong has a very elaborate planning system. And you can go to the government's website, the planning department website for details. We have different level of plans. For the whole of Hong Kong, we have a territorial development strategy, such as the Hong Kong 2030 Plus plan. And then we have statutory plans. The more well-known is the outline zoning plan, OZP, and then we have development permission area plan. We have administrative plans as well. And then we have comprehensive development area zoning, which is a form of development control tool, similar to other land zonings on the OZPs. So again, I won't go into detail, but just want the audience to be aware that we do have a very elaborate, a very advanced kind of planning system in Hong Kong. And we have multiple studies and procedures done during the planning process. I just illustrate some of those studies. We have different stages of study: preliminary study, planning and feasibility study, detailed study. For infrastructure planning, we do look at transport connectivity, roadworks, public utilities, and facilities. And the Town Planning Board, under the law, has stipulated very clear procedures, which are statutory and which allows time for representations, objections, hearings. We have various kinds of assessment, environmental impact assessment, traffic impact assessment, and so on. And then when it comes to design stage, engineering design, detailed design, site investigation, many kinds of works to be done. And then the funding processes within government and also in the Legislative Council. And then, of course, land resumption and compensation procedures, the levels of compensation. And there are also mechanisms for synchronizing the various processes and projects. Now, whether or not we can have more efficient, more effective synchronization, that is a challenge to us. Now, planning is important for housing, or sometimes planning is regarded as one of the paths towards solving the housing affordability problem. Now, I just used these two reports for illustration. You can go into detail. Now, in the UK, a couple of years ago, the government published eventually a white paper on planning for the future. And before that, of course, different stakeholders, organizations, they came up with various ideas. And this on the slide, on the right hand of the left hand side, are those suggestions made by Centre for Cities of the UK. Suggestions on how flexible zoning can help to end the housing crisis. About a more flexible kind of zoning code, better organized public consultations. Ultimately, of course, it is a political choice, because how do you decide on zoning, land use, whether the zoning code could be made more flexible, more accommodating towards the present needs. And if that is possible, then of course more land can be released or can be developed, because oftentimes we are talking about developable land, not just land in isolation. In the US, a study in 2017 by a think tank found that housing affordability spending, in terms of prices, rentals, is highest in the most regulated states. And that the reason seems to be quite natural. So for Hong Kong, do we need a planning reform, I think we do need to look at our planning system more comprehensively, and certainly there's room for reform. We have a more flexible zoning system. At the moment, our plans are rather restrictive, rather directive. Is there room for relaxation in terms of spatial and height restrictions, plot ratios, aesthetic considerations? Of course, there are always upsides and downsides in terms of any changes to those guidelines and restrictions. Can we streamline our planning processes, cut down statutory requirements, clear procedural bottlenecks, synchronize various processes and steps so as to shorten the overall timeframe? And because there are various processes involved and there are different departments, bureaus in charge of those processes, so is there room for better coordination so that the overall timeframe can be shortened? And in terms of public consultations and town planning board hearing processes, they are essential. But can they be made more efficient, more conducive to a workable outcome? I think that is the challenge before us. And finally, we have to remove some myths in strategic planning, because somehow in terms of housing, we can say there are all kinds of experts. Every person in our society can be an expert because we face the housing problem. And here I just try to make a few points. What and who to blame? Because people tend to put the blame on certain sectors. Or housing issue, of course, developers are the culprit, government is the culprit, planners, overseas buyers pushing up prices. Actually, that may not be the key reason. And then where maybe part of our community is too greedy. In fact, everybody is part of this overall crisis, because I used to say that before you become a landlord, you want prices to go down. But once you are a landlord, you don't want prices to go down. That is natural inclination. The land supply shortage, how real? Is it easier? Is it really easy to get land, or is it very, very hard to get land? Demand management. Now, several years ago, government introduced additional stamp duties to suppress demand. But whether or not that is effective can be debated. But managing demand could be is very necessary at certain times, because you don't want people's expectations to be based on prices continue to grow. Because if that is the expectation, then of course there will be more people buying, and that will push up prices. Is it the case that it takes longer time to build public housing? I would say no, because the housing authority, which is responsible for public housing, often only gets land that has yet to be spade ready. In other words, you have to spend time on a lot of pre-construction activities, consultation, getting town planning board approvals, and so forth. And that is the main reason for the time, the more lengthy time taken, not the actual time of construction. And government intervention, will rent control be helpful? Rent subsidy, transitional housing. My answer is yes, but, because yes, you can help to relieve some burden on those people affected. But even with rent control, rent subsidy, you do not improve the living conditions of those people staying in subdivided units. So the answer to really solving their problem is to build more public housing, which is more spacious, relatively speaking, cheaper. Actually, that's a good way of rent control if you live in public housing. And ultimately, some people will suggest, well, maybe we should follow Singapore. Now, I'm sure Donald Low will talk more about that, but it is not a quick way. Let me finish with a couple more slides. In terms of land supply, there's no easy way. Now here, there are many myths. Here I just highlight two myths. The first one is there is enough land for more housing, such as idle brownfield and agricultural land in private hands, only if the government has the will to proceed with statutory resumption. Reclamation is not necessary. This is an argument against reclamation. I beg to disagree. Now, of course, how much reclamation should we make, that could be debated. But the reality is, even if we proceed with resumption of both brownfield and agricultural land, still we need to go through procedures. There are still objections. They are still as challenging as other options. Reclamation is unavoidable if we really want to secure a large supply of new land. Another often cited myth is because in Hong Kong, for the new territories' indigenous inhabitants, they have the so-called small house policy. And people will blame that policy for the existing land shortage. But the reality is, small house policy, even though it might be unfair to non-indigenous residents, but it is not the main reason for land shortage for housing. Over a decade, during 2008 to 17, according to government figures, on average, only less than 1,000 small house approvals has been approved per year. So this is a very small number. And even if you don't give such permission, in other words, you get rid of the small house policy, that doesn't help much in solving our housing shortage problem. Finally, can we go the Singapore way? Theoretically speaking, yes, but it depends on whether we can achieve much given our current starting point. We are quite different from Singapore. Singapore has 80% in public housing. In Hong Kong, we have 50-50 owners tenants split, roughly, and then 54 to 46 private public split. And we have land supply problems. So we can't just imagine that once we adopt a so-called Singapore style policy, then everything will be solved. It takes time, it takes steps to realize whatever outcome we would like to achieve. So Hong Kong cannot adopt the Singapore model easily and expect quick win within the coming decade. It takes time. Even if we say from today, we adopt the Singapore policy or vision, it may at least take another 20 or even more years in order to get what Singapore is today. And for public housing, as I said earlier, the availability of spade-ready land is most important. And if we are going to adopt the Singapore way, then we have to make sure that we don't send the wrong message. The wrong message being that if the message is that no more land will be given to private housing, then immediately the present private housing market will have a serious shortage. Perception-wise, people will think that given that there's no more land for new public private housing, then prices will go up, rent will go up. And that is something which will create a lot of pressure on affordability as well. So I'll stop here, and later on I'll come back during the Q&A to address some of the questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. We already have a lot of questions from the floor. I think everyone is really concerned about this issue. It's really a chronic and serious problem in Hong Kong. And now we pass the time to Professor Low, who's going to talk about experience in Singapore and housing issue in general. So over to you, Professor Low. The mic.
Thank you very much, Isabella. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thanks a lot to Professor Cheung for hosting this policy dialogue. So Professor Cheung spoke, I'll touch briefly on the Singapore model. So I'll share a bit about what the Singapore model is. At this point, I'll just highlight three key points about the Singapore model of housing. The first is that the Singapore model relies a lot more on public housing, as Anthony mentioned, than the case in Singapore, than the case in Hong Kong. Like more than 80% of Singaporeans live in public housing, and the vast majority of them who live in public housing live as homeowners, right? So within public housing, which is already a very big part of Singapore's housing mix, more than 80%. Within public housing, 90% of of them are homeowners. And only 10% are rental. So that's a huge difference in context, right? As Professor Cheung mentioned in his last slide, in Hong Kong, it is far more evenly split between public and private. And within public, it's also very evenly split 50-50 between home ownership and rental. So that's the first point, public housing being a much larger part of Singapore's housing mix than it is in Hong Kong. The second is actually Singapore is far more land constrained than Hong Kong, right? Its population is about Hong Kong's population is about 50% larger than Singapore's. And is actually about less than half of Hong Kong's overall total land area. So solving the housing problem, as Professor Cheung mentioned, where there is a will, there is a way. Solving the housing problem in Singapore's context meant, enduring and persistent focus on ensuring sufficient land supply, right? Ensuring sufficient land supply for the purposes of housing, setting land, planning for it, right? That to ensure that there is enough land for housing, particularly public housing. Third, another major difference in the context of Singapore and Hong Kong, the Singapore state is, I would say, a lot more autonomous, right? When I say autonomous, I mean it is not subordinate to interest of developers, of interest groups, of a particular political interest group. So the state is a lot more autonomous, a lot less constrained compared to the Hong Kong state, which faces far more constraints. So that means, as I agree with Professor Cheung's last point, that Hong Kong cannot simply copy Singapore's public housing model, cannot easily adopt Singapore's housing model. As Hong Kongers, I think, are finding out now, a policy which works well in one context may not be easily or effectively adopted in another context. Right? Zero COVID may work very well in mainland cities, but cannot be easily implemented in Hong Kong. Right? Similarly with housing, high levels of the kind of public housing model that Singapore has cannot be easily adopted by Hong Kong, at least not in the short-term horizon. So let me elaborate on some of those points. So this presentation of mine really elaborates on an article I wrote 3 years ago on why Hong Kong cannot copy Singapore's approach to public housing. So I'll talk about what is Singapore's approach to public housing. And second, just because Hong Kong cannot copy Singapore's public housing approach does not mean Hong Kong cannot learn from. Right? Copying and learning from are quite separate things. And maybe we can have a discussion with the audience on what you think can be learned from Singapore's housing approach, even if it cannot be copied. The first thing I should point out is that public housing, not only is it quantitatively a much more important part of Singapore's housing mix, it is also qualitatively very important. Right? It is used to serve multiple objectives. The first, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is home ownership, right? And home ownership is not just, it's a generally good thing. People who live in their own homes, tend to care more about the neighborhood and so on. But really, the Singapore state, right from the start, in the early 1960s, saw home ownership as an essential attribute of nation building. Second, public housing is used as an instrument to engineer certain desirable social outcomes, particularly social and ethnic integration. So in any public housing estate, you see that represents a microcosm of Singapore society, different ethnic groups, different income groups, and also ideally, increasingly, different age groups in a public housing, not just within at the estate level, even at the precinct level. Each precinct is about 15 blocks of housing development board flats, HDB flats. Third, very crucially, and this is a point most analysts don't really understand about the Singapore model, is that housing is not just housing for its own sake. It's not just providing a roof over people's heads. It is about land reform. It is about giving citizens a stake, a piece of capital, an asset. Right? So Singapore's welfare system is often referred to as productivist. Right? It's aimed at economic development. It is aimed to encourage production. It's true. And part of that productivist welfare state means Singapore has hardly any unemployment benefits. The state doesn't provide citizens with any pensions, right? Your own pension your pensions are your own retirement savings. But there's one area where the state does quite a bit of redistribution, land, right? And the vehicle for that land reform, for that land redistribution is public housing. Fourth, public housing and housing more generally, but really public housing is seen as a tool for asset appreciation. You buy it, you own it, you have a stake in seeing its value maintained, and through various policy tools, government also tries to help that asset appreciate in value. And when you retire, it becomes a form of retirement security. You can sell it and downgrade, or you can rent out the room of your public housing flat. And finally, the Singapore is oftentimes referred to as a one-party state, even though it has regular elections. And right from the start, the ruling party, Lee Kuan Yew's party, People's Action Party, saw public housing and high levels of home ownership as a major source of political legitimacy, and a very vivid, very visible demonstration of a high capacity, high performing state. Now you might say, how wonderful, what? One tool, public housing, can serve so many objectives. But I'm sure those of you who are studying public policy, you know that, right, the more policy objectives you have, the harder it is to have only a single tool to try to achieve these multiple objectives. And I will argue, in my slides, that there is increasing tension between these multiple objectives. Right? You can't have one tool serving so many objectives without some contradictions or at least some tensions across these multiple objectives. So I'll just briefly of public housing in Singapore. First, the importance of home ownership, right? This is Lee Kuan Yew. You own it, it's an asset that will increase in value as the city grows. The homeowner keeps the public space clean. The person who rents doesn't care, he just looks after the inside. So I say, let everybody own a home. Everybody, their value goes up, the place is clean and beautiful. We are asking people to get their sons to do national service, right? Military service, to learn to fight for the country. Unless you give them a home, why should they be fighting? Right? So it's really seen as part of nation building. This is the situation that the PAP, the government inherited in 1965, when Singapore really had very poor slum-like housing conditions that were unbecoming of aspiring global city. So the PAP's election manifesto in 1959 really centered on providing housing and jobs. Very early on, the first statutory board it created was the Housing and Development Board, the HDB, which of course was credited as the key agency, the lead agency, ensuring that Singapore does not have a housing shortage problem. And so you see public housing has kept pace. This is the resident population in Singapore that lives in public housing. It has kept pace with the growth in Singapore's resident population, right? It has, and as I said earlier, more than 80% of people live in HDB flats in Singapore. Second, I mentioned that the second goal of public housing really is social, economic, and ethnic integration. And there are various tools to achieve that, right? From the mix of different housing types, flat types in each public housing estate, to the ethnic integration policy, to setting a quota for permanent residents, non-citizens, right? And also, the plan always was to make sure that public housing estates were accessible, right? Were well connected. So this was the concept plan. This is Anthony spoke briefly just now about the planning process, and it starts with a master plan, right? A concept plan in the case of Singapore on where you would locate your housing estates. And you can see that the original idea, and to a large extent, planners and the Public Housing Development Board has kept to that original concept plan, right? Almost all the public housing estates are within a 20-kilometer radius of the city center in the south, and they are well connected by public transit. Right, so this is where the major public housing estates in Singapore are, and you can see that, right, it has more or less realized the original 1970-1971 concept plan vision, right? So the vision or the concept was we will have high density, very much like Hong Kong's new towns, right? In the new territories. Singapore's high density satellite towns built within, right, like concentric circles out of radiating from the central business district in the south. The first few public housing estates were built here, right, around here, and then over time, around here were built in the 60s and early 70s. Then other towns like Bedok, Tampines, Clementi, Bukit Batok, all these were built in the 80s, right? And then further out, Woodlands, Punggol, these were built in the 90s, right? And increasingly they were served with not just expressways, but also public transit, including MRT lines. And Anthony spoke about in Hong Kong's case, the binding constraint, I think, is securing land, right? Ensuring sufficient supply of land. Here is where my point about the Singapore state being less constrained, being far more autonomous than the Hong Kong state, comes in, right? Right from the start, the PAP government saw that the most critical tool you need is land. So they passed a very powerful Land Acquisition Act, right? That replaced the 1920 Land Acquisition Ordinance. And this is a very powerful piece of legislation. If the state wants to take your land, you cannot say no. You basically cannot say no. You can quibble about the compensation, right? You can try, but essentially you cannot say no, right? The state can take land and use it for public purposes with hardly any constraints, or with hardly any legal constraints. And on top of that, that will complemented by resettlement policy. So you might say, isn't this very draconian? Isn't this very authoritarian? Guess what? This is what you need to do if you want to pursue land reform, right? South Korea did it too. Taiwan did it too, right? So land acquisition, land reform, these things, right? They're two sides of the same coin. And then after that, right, public housing, as public housing was being developed, home ownership became very soon, at a very early stage, became an essential element of that. And over time, the way public flats have been allocated has evolved. Right? So for instance, previously it was a queuing system, right? There was a waiting list system, a booking system, registration for flat system. Currently, it's a much more market-based system. Currently, the system is called built to order. So as once the government will announce, right, we are thinking of developing public housing in this piece of land that has been made available for public housing, and people are invited to not ballot but to apply. Right, I would like to indicate my interest. Right, pay a deposit on a flat that is built in this new estate, and once there's sufficient orders, the government will build. So that's much more market driven. Right, the risk with relying on queues is that, as Anthony was saying, when prices are rising, the queue suddenly increase. When prices fall, the queue suddenly shrinks. Right? So demand as reflected by queues is not always very indicative of real demand. Whereas the market-based built-to-order system is much more flexible, much more responsive. And these are actual buyers who have paid the deposit, right? And once the flat is built, they will move in. So that is a much more responsive system to meeting demand. Which I think Hong Kong can learn something from. Anyway, this is all background on. I think a big component, the other thing I should have mentioned earlier, is what enables high levels of home ownership, or what supports high levels of home ownership, even for public housing in Singapore, 90%, is that the Central Provident Fund. Right? It's like Hong Kong's MPF, with a big difference. Right? Singapore's Central Provident Fund is much larger. Right? Citizens pay up to 37% of their 37% of their monthly incomes. In Hong Kong, it's only up to 10%. Right? So the CPF is a much larger part of Singaporeans' lives, and therefore it is used for a lot more things. It's not just for retirement; it can also be used to pay our housing mortgages. And third, it is used to pay for healthcare expenses and health insurance. So this was introduced in 1955, but in 1968, the newly elected government, the PAP government, the newly independent government of Singapore, decided to allow people to use their CPF to pay for housing mortgages, right, including public housing mortgages. And over time, policies were revised to encourage home ownership. So this is an illustration of the securing land, how Singapore has been able to do it. So the red parts of the map represent the parts that are urban, built up, right? And with most of these parts, it's not just for industrial use, but also and commercial use, but also for residential users. You see, most of Singapore, maybe 70% of Singapore, right? The middle part is set aside for as a water catchment area. The western part is set aside for also water catchment and also military training. But pretty much other than that, this part is the Old Paya Lebar Airport, which is now also being taken back and to be developed for housing. So, about more than 70% of Singapore has, is land available for housing, right? So this is my second point early, right at the start, right? That securing enough land was, even though Singapore is far more land constrained than Hong Kong, ensuring enough land supply was a critical part of solving the housing problem in Singapore. By contrast, look at Hong Kong, right? Even in Ireland or in Kowloon, and certainly in the new territories, large tracts of land are simply not available or simply have not been developed, set aside for housing. Fourth major objective of public housing in Singapore was about asset appreciation. Right? So how does that happen? First, obviously with economic growth, economic development, people's incomes rising, prices of resale flats in Singapore would rise, right? That's a given. Second, the state does things like upgrading and redevelop old estates, build new flats, existing old flats and give the old owners there the first right to purchase the newly redeveloped flats in these old estates. And flats in old estates are very valuable, right? Because all the amenities are there, it's close to the city center, public transport links are better developed, and so on. So these are ways in which people's asset values, hope HDB flat owners' asset values can be enhanced. So in Singapore, if your flat, ironically, in most cities, if you are told that your flat has been scheduled for redevelopment, that's usually bad news. In Singapore, if you are told that your flat or your neighborhood has been scheduled or has been planned for redevelopment, you've hit the jackpot. People welcome this news. In fact, a few years ago, people were speculating, right? They're buying into these old flats in anticipation that those flats would be set aside or would be identified for these redevelopment programs. And the government had to put a stop to that. 5 years to say, hey, not every flat will enjoy this selective en bloc redevelopment scheme. So this is what I mentioned earlier, that public housing is a source of retirement. The government wants it to be an appreciating asset. So this is what it's looked like since the peak, right, of housing prices in just before the start of May 97. So that is 100. So yes, so this is what this illustrates. Why did prices come down and stay low for nearly a decade? And the reason for that is that first you had the Asian crisis, then you had SARS in 2003, so prices stayed low, right? And in 2000 there was a recession because of the crash of the dot-com bubble in the US and the slowdown of the electronic sector. So, but mainly the reason prices were stagnant for about a decade in the 2000s was not just external economic conditions, was also the fact that right before 97, because of the lengthening queues, the government built lots of flats. But after the Asian crisis, that queue more or less disappeared. So the government was stuck with an oversupply of flats. And it took nearly 10 years to clear that oversupply. And then when that oversupply was cleared, the next factor kicked in, which was Singapore's growing population. And between 2000 and 2010, Singapore's population grew by about 20%, mostly due to immigration. And that drove this increase in prices from around 2006 to 2013. And government in the early 2010s introduced a series of property cooling measures at I think 5 rounds before it was able to bring down prices to more affordable or sustainable. So Singapore has also had its own struggles with housing affordability. And this is about public housing, right? HDB resale flats. The situation in the private market is, of course, probably more extreme. During the pandemic, you can see housing prices picking up again, which is quite remarkable. In the pandemic, people, and what Anthony said, John, there's a lot of latent demand for housing. And I think during the pandemic, people say, oh no, you're going to be working from home more, maybe I should upgrade, or maybe I should spend more on my house, buy a better flat. And so you see that translating into higher housing prices. Also, along with retirement security, Singapore's challenge now is population aging, right? So whereas in the first 40 years or maybe first 50 years of Singapore's independence, the goal was helping people accumulate assets. I think for the next 50 years, the goal must be to help people unlock those assets, right? Decumulate, turn those housing assets into equity cash that they can use for retirement. So the government in recent years, in the last 10 years, has introduced things like a lease buyback scheme. HDB flats are sold on a 99-year lease. So the government, so let's say you bought a flat from government, you've stayed there for 40 years, throughout your working life, the government might say, I'll buy back your remaining lease. right? Let's say 50 years, and give you cash, so that when you pass on, the state reverts, the flat reverts to the state. But meanwhile, you get a sum of money, right, to help with your retirement. Finally, I said public housing is the source, very important source of political legitimacy for the ruling party. And you can see, the way public housing has evolved. Increasingly, you can't tell public housing in Singapore apart from private housing. The only thing the way to tell when I bring students to visit Singapore and I bring them to visit a public housing estate is see if there's a fence around the estate. If there's a fence around the estate, it's private. If there's no fence around the estate and it's free access, it's a public housing estate, even if it looks like private. Let's look at some of these sky terraces. This is public housing, right? And people are always amazed that this is government subsidized, government developed flats. Okay, so maybe I'll end here and take questions if there are any about what Hong Kong might conceivably learn from the Singapore experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Low. Now we coming to Dr. Stephen Wong. So Dr. Wong, please.
I just want to make sure you're here and also see my share screen. I wanted to cover 3 areas. One is the large-scale development, urbanization. Second is the sort of the procedure, and third is sort of the housing. Echoing what Professor CHEUNG and Professor Low has discussed. Just a see whether I can next page down. So this is just a usually people see the percentage of developed area on the right-hand corner as a pie chart. You get a sense that we don't have a lot of high density urbanized area. But if you look at the map, the deep green and the dark green and the light green are areas that are basically not developed. And so, for example, most of the eastern part of Hong Kong, the central part of New Territories, as well as a large part of Lantau Island and Hong Kong Island. And as a result, our urbanized area is only around 20% of the total land area in Hong Kong. So it's a matter of history, I guess, sort of the vision of how much urbanization that Hong Kong needs to have compared to, for example, 50% in Shenzhen. And if I am correct, Singapore is an even higher percentage of urbanized area, closer to 70% or even more. So from 20% to 50% or 70%, there is obviously a judgment call and discussion as to how much we should urbanize. And one thought is obviously a lot of these deep green and light green areas are mountain. And in Hong Kong, we don't have a lot of flatlands. But again, in Hong Kong Island, a lot of mountains are built on with residential and commercial activities. And obviously, there are a lot of reclamations going on as well before. This is what I call the urbanization effort or building new towns. In the past, we've urbanized new territories by building new towns, starting from the 70s when I was growing up. So in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, in that 30 years, we have developed 9 new towns. So let's say, three per decade. And we stopped building new towns, since 2000. Early 2000. And so the last new town that we have is Dong Chung, and the next new town, which is smaller in size, and it's going to be Hong Shui Kiu and Wudong North and Fanning North. So these are smaller, and so basically we don't have any new towns that is completed for about 20 years, compared to in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we have 3 new towns every 10 years. So as a result, when we sort of project as to how much more land that we need in the next 30 years, in the past, 6 years, we've been advocating numbers 9,000 hectares. 9,000 hectares is, a lot more than what the government originally planned for, or they calculated was around 4,800 hectares. And the reason is very simple. You know, land is about, yes, living, and yes, about other social and economic activities, as we don't have enough land for commercial buildings or, you know, even social welfare facilities, elderly homes. And for living, it's not just about price, it's about basically per capita living area. So compared to Singapore, our per capita, you know, living area is, you know, we are around 160 square feet. If I'm correct, Singapore is closer to 260 and 270. So just, it's a mathematical problem, isn't it? If you wanted to actually catch up on average, which is prerequisite of actually hopefully a bit more evenly distributed. But just on average, that's a mathematical problem that you need to, if the numerator, you know, you want to change the average, if the denominator, even if the denominator number of population doesn't change, in order to catch up with the average living area increased by 60%, the numerator, i.e. the total living area in Hong Kong, needs to increase by 60%. And where that 60% comes from is obviously by a lot bigger effort in urbanization. We talk about 60%, not about 10%, not about 20%, it's about 60%. That's a lot. Now, we basically compiled what the government current plan is. It was less before, and now they are actually getting more aggressive, and we appreciate that. And so it's closer to my 9,000 target, but still short. But it's certainly higher than what they had before. But this 7,000 hectares planned supply, if you look at various areas, this obviously will take a very long time. And a lot of these areas, for example, you know, you heard about this northern metropolis, basically is the green areas that is in the north, because they included a lot of already built up area. For example, they include a whole sort of funding new town already in the sort of northern metropolis vision. But if you just look at the new developed land, those are the green area, the Hong Shui Kiu 400 hectares, the Sun Tin 300 hectares, the Lord Marshall Loop 84, the Kudong North 400, and the new territories north is about 1,000 hectares. So these are the big pieces that actually are composed of the new supply within the so-called northern metropolis, because as opposed to what they call Victoria Harbour metropolis, obviously you already have a lot of built-up area. What is new for the metropolis, so Victoria Harbour metropolis is the Lantau Tomorrow vision. So similarly, northern metropolis is not about the whole thing. They just kind of already built up in the vision. That's just a name. But in terms of new actual supply, that's the green area. However, since we are still undersupplied in my thought, so we basically look for other potential development areas aside, on top of what the government is thinking. If you just look at, for example, the northern new territories, so we highlighted the additional potential for 2,400 hectares. These are basically composed of flat lands, so they're not on the mountain. So number one, they're not part of the country park. So they're outside of country park, and mostly outside even green belts. But obviously they were composed of different types of land, brownfields, for example. A lot of people talk about brownfield, but brownfield, you need to have a comprehensive urbanization plan in order to actually properly use all of these brownfields. Obviously they compose of some farmlands, a lot of the squatters, and so you have basically is a whole sort of urbanization effort that Donald has talked about, sort of the land reform and land redistribution and land acquisition effort in the decades ago in Singapore on a holistic level. We haven't done that really, right, in sort of a lot of the new territories. So it's a social effort and a social debate as to whether we want to actually rekindle and exercise that sort of motivation and aggressive land reform in a civilized way, in a legal way, in a properly done way, to actually release a lot of this land potential in Hong Kong. And when we talk about land, obviously you need to talk about infrastructure, because that's how you release the land value, so that you just in order to live and work there. So the yellow lines are the existing major railways. The planned railways are the green lines. Basically, a lot of these are sort of the land town tomorrow related infrastructure, which I always thought is very important infrastructure that links the west part of New Territories through Lantau Island, through the Lantau tomorrow to Hong Kong Island. Basically, a new set of infrastructure that can connect the western side of Hong Kong to alleviate already what is a very congested traffic in Hong Kong there. And so the red lines are sort of what we thought is important from a think tank perspective, and the blue line are what is discussed in the policy address lately related to the northern metropolis. In terms of roads, similarly, you see the red lines are basically what was proposed by the government related to the Lantau tomorrow, and the blue lines is what we thought is important if you were to actually large scale urbanize the New Territories going forward. So I wanted to move on to the second part of my discussion as to, basically, when we talked about red tapes, a lot of these planning restrictions, a lot of these regulatory restrictions are obviously will slow down the land and housing development. And it was well documented by, for example, academics, for example, Edward Glaser. But when we actually do cutting red tapes, my immediate question is, we are facing a housing crisis at this moment. So can we actually solve it within 5 years? Now, so obviously it's a tall order. So I listed out in mathematical terms. So for the next 5 years, business as usual, we have around 180,000 units, public and private. So you're talking about 30,000 units per year, which is not a lot. But since we have already had a shortage in the past many years, specifically, I counted for the past 8 years, the actual supply and the government targeted demand gap was around 128,000 units. If we were to actually catch up those 100,000 units within 5 years, i.e. increasing completion by that, so the total, the next 5 years will need to be around 300,000 units for 5 years, which is around 60,000 units per year, which is lower than what was the famous or the infamous 85,000 units per year target before. But 60,000 units per year for the next 5 years is something that is urgently needed. And how do we basically do it? Is actually by moving the 5 to 10 years, 2026 to 2030. Originally, we had around 230,000 units that were targeted to be completed, business as usual. So by cutting red tapes, the question is how much red tapes and whether we can cut enough red tape so that we can move part of that, i.e. 120,000 units, from the 6 to 10 years to 0 to 5 years, so that we can actually alleviate the immediate housing concerns. And if you can do that, it would cut the waiting line from 6 years to around 3.7 years. Now, so I listed out actually cutting red tapes in 3 different categories. The first one is cutting red tapes in large-scale development for urbanizations, such as new towns or what they call the NDA new development areas. So you see the green box are sort of the milestones. The green box are the milestone. For example, you need funding approval, you need finalized development plan, you need to have a planning completion, you have the land clearance, you have reclamations, and out of that, you have different procedures. I listed out in different colors. For example, the pink colors are the preliminary planning procedure. The land administration is basically in gray area. So within all these, there are 5 recommendations that we come up with. I'm not going to elaborate all these here, but each of these can it be shortened, can be make it more efficient, without sacrificing the merit of the planning and the engagement of the society, as well as the fairness of the acquisition. So I think these are just to give you a sense of the number of procedures that is involved and sort of the overall timeline. The second types of red tape cutting is sort of speeding up private housing development. Again, we listed out sort of the supply chain, if you will, all the way from either you have a agricultural land going through a rezoning with the town planning board, or you have a comprehensive development area, CDA, or you already have a urban redevelopment. So you go through these process with 3 different procedures, and we have sort of 5 potential recommendations to be considered to speed that up. And lastly, public housing. And again, it's also a supply chain. And what I focus on nowadays is not just on the upstream of how do you acquire land, rezoning and all these, but also on the building, actually, the design and build process, for example. Can it be combined? Can it work with private sectors? Can we actually utilize the private sector's building capabilities to actually speed that up? For example, can you utilize technologies to speed things up? Now, and the last part of my discussions in the next 5 minutes is the housing policy. So we talked about large-scale urbanization. We talk about, okay, so we actually have a concrete goal of actually having, trying to solve things in the next 5 years by cutting red tapes, large scale urbanization red tapes, private housing red tapes, or public housing red tapes. But the third part is sort of the vision of the housing policy. So what do we want to achieve, like what Donald has said? There is a purpose, there is a goal. And I totally agree that obviously Hong Kong is starting with a different place. We're going to have a different method. But if we don't change, we don't have a goal, then we will always be here as to where we are. So, so where do we want to go? What is actually, do we agree that what we are seeing in Singapore is actually something that we desire? If that's the case, then how do we get there? I think that's sort of the question. Obviously, I take a view that the Singapore housing situation nowadays is a desirable goal for Hong Kong. And to get there from where we are, as Professor CHEUNG said, takes a long time, potentially, a lot of effort, but we need to think about how. So I'm not going to repeat the situation here in Hong Kong. This is covered by Professor CHEUNG. It's half and half, public and private, and a lot of the public are actually rental, and only a few of them are subsidized public housing. And in Hong Kong situation, obviously, is worse from a price perspective. I'm not going to go through that because obviously the property price is increased higher than the rental price, higher than GDP, higher than household income. That obviously creates a lot of social tension. And I wanted to actually go over some of the peculiarities of the current public housing system. For example, this is the turnover rate. Turnover means that you buy and sell, because if you, let's say my sons actually now they are studying in new territory, so I actually have to move because they go to different areas. But if you get stuck in a public housing rental unit, or get stuck in an unpaid premium HOS, meaning that it's hard to actually sell my units and get back the same amount, actually buy a different flat, then the turnover rate is artificially low for HOS and TPS with unpaid premium, which is the red line. I'm not going to go into details of the mechanics of unpaid and paid premium. There's a bit of a peculiarities in Hong Kong, and we roughly calculate because of what we call the dead weight loss, because we cannot sell the public housing rental units, because we cannot buy, and therefore we have to, and because the government is not getting a rent that is even can in the long run compensate operating costs. So the dissipation value of the land value is around 200% of the GDP. And the other peculiarity is also a peculiar observation for the current public housing is that the private renters Obviously the household size, the average person per unit is increasing, right? Because the rental is increasing, we are squeezing a bit more people in the same unit. There's a market mechanism. But for the public rental unit, it's the opposite. Where everybody is in private sector squeezing themselves in a smaller place. Actually, the number of people per unit in public housing is actually getting less. And that's sort of on the bottom chart. On the top chart is the even more peculiar observation that even if we have actually similar amount of new completions in private and public housing within the same period, right, around 126, 143,000, but the population actually to be able to live in there is drastically different. We are able to house 500,000 people in private housing with the same amount of new completion addition, where you only house additional 4,000 people in the public housing within that same period. So it's we can discuss about sort of the effectiveness of the well-off tenants policies. I think Anthony is very familiar with that, and the progress is under-occupied cases and how it's the enforcement and execution of utilizing those inefficiently used units, or even I think that can come into debate. And what is a peculiar observation about public housing is also manifested in the divorce rate as well. You see that the number of divorced females and the number of divorced males are actually peculiarly very high relatively compared to other types of housing. Now, so with respect to my last slide, to answer my own question, we thought hard about, okay, if we share this goal eventually of how do we get to where we want the Singapore model, where you have a relatively separated market between the private and public market, and the public market actually gives people a choice of whether you rent or you own, and a lot of people choose to own in Singapore. But in Hong Kong, we are not afforded to an option for people. And obviously we are facing a long queue, so a lot of people are thinking about, okay, let's just get the units done, which is my first and second part of my discussion. But if we actually get a lot more in completions, can we actually fix all these peculiarities I just listed out before, and to actually strive to the better goal or better vision that Singapore has? And I listed out 10 strategies potentially as a roadmap to get there. I'm not going to go into details because it's basically the thought, but I can talk about the thought and strategy behind it. Is that we need some time to fix the completions. So we obviously need to take care of people that are actually queuing up. But obviously we know there are potential side effect of giving subsidies. So you hopefully have together with other measures to fix that. So that's an immediate step. But on the longer run, you wanted to have a bit more liquidity within the unpaid premium market, which is sort of the public market that is separated from the private market because they're unpaid premium for the HOS and the other types of public housings. So therefore, they become a market in itself, and they can trade with only people that are eligible within that market. And by doing that, you need to actually have to free up the stock within all the rental market, so that unpaid premium public market can grow in size, can have enough depth of liquidity for it to function well, and that is also relatively separate from the private market. So these are sort of the thoughts that we listed out as potential roadmap to get to where Singapore is over time. So with that, I finish my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Wong. And so we're coming to the Q&A section, but before we begin, because we have a lot of questions coming in, and I'm still seeing questions from the Q&A box. I would like to ask, I was born and raised in this territory, and I see how this becoming a chronic issue myself. I personally experienced that, but I was fortunate enough with my parents planning very much ahead when I was pretty young. So I'm actually one of the lucky ones. But then I also look at, like, I really appreciate what the government has been trying to do. I mean, trying to increase the number of provision in terms of the housing, the public housing, and having all these home ownership schemes. But then I've been also doing some research on looking at the recent, like there will be a next round of sale on in a number of places, like in North Point, in Kai Tak, in Sha Tin. But then the flat is pretty small. I mean, it's like, I would use the word like a shoebox, like what is happening is like, for example, the price range is from 1.24 million Hong Kong dollars to 5.31. I think the highest is in North Point, which is in on the Hong Kong Island. And then the smallest flat is like 186 square feet, which is really, really small. Now, so we have been talking about housing as a mathematical issue, mathematical problems. But then I want to look at about the quality of living. So we've got this kind of looking like an affordable house, I mean, provided by the public housing. But what about the quality of living? And what about those living in a subdivided flat? And what about those who are living under the poverty, the poverty line? What is the take of the three of you who are experts in, economics and housing policy and issues? Oh, what can we do about that? Because I mean, I personally don't see it just as a mathematical problem. I personally see it like beyond this. Apart from the number that we have to solve, is also the well-being of the people. So how do you guys see that? From the view of the quality of life and in terms, like in terms of living within environment, especially now we're living in a COVID-19 situation where we're always staying at home.
Isabel, I'm not sure I try to tackle this, but frankly, I think the mathematical problem is to get to the welfare of the people, and the well-being of the people, that's the goal, right? Why are we doing this social math? The math is actually to solve the well-being of the people. And the math is that there are two math involved here. One is obviously how much money people make, that is solve the disparity of income. That's a math obviously a economic mathematical problems. That you have such a disparity, therefore the affordability of people are very different. And second, however, it's obviously a supply-demand gap to the extent that if we have enough total living area available, right, then obviously that not just the average size of the flat that people can afford will be bigger, as I said, hopefully come to the Singapore average number. But also, even if we are given the income disparity fixed, if you have larger amount of total supply, won't you think that it will actually be able to afford more living area across the different income or asset wealth segment of the people? So it's obviously not just about the land development and the living area development is for the people, and that is a precondition, a necessary but insufficient condition, as you said, to solve the overall well-being of the people. But obviously, if you can at least address this precondition, you have more total stock for people to actually bid from, then yes, or allocate for, then obviously, then even the lower segment of people, if the income doesn't increase drastically, hopefully they will, with other policy measures, they still can have a living better environment. I think that's sort of the goal.
Isabella, I think your point is well taken. But if you were a policymaker right now in Hong Kong, I think you have to prioritize the demand. I think because we are so short of numbers, and numbers immediately creates a lot of political pressure. So therefore, sometimes when you're faced with a choice, then you think, okay, maybe we must meet the numbers demand first. The other things maybe can take time, but I'm not suggesting that numbers is the only issue. I mean, that was the dilemma that I faced when I was secretary. But coming back to the current situation, I tried to start from a very modest beginning. My view at that time was public rental housing standard could be a good start, because for public housing, the policy is, and still is, that the person area would be 7 square meters, internal floor area. So that could be quite a good standard in the case of Hong Kong, given the overall shortage. Now, if you look at private housing, if you look at subdivided units, of course, they're far below that 7 square meters. I'm not suggesting that 7 square meters is enough. I mean, if you compare Hong Kong to Shenzhen, Shanghai, we are worse. But at least this is good enough at the beginning. And in public rental housing, in public housing estates, in fact, we allocate 20 to 30% of the area to landscaping. And that's why the overall ambience in public housing estates, in my view, is better than many private housing blocks. So if we could start with this public rental housing criteria or quality of living, although it's not good enough, but it is quite a good beginning for Hong Kong, then maybe we could gradually improve. But it all depends on land space available. I think that's the main constraint. Because, and that's why I agree with Stephen that we should not unduly confine our vision in terms the amount of in terms of the amount of land that we will need. We will never have excess land, because if we got more land, then we can afford to increase the per capita living space. And right now in Hong Kong, we are quite below what is desirable.
Isabella, is it okay if I address your other question to me about fiscal burden of Singapore's public housing?
Right, sure, yes.
Yeah, so because I think Anthony and Stephen addressed the question about quality of life in housing. So that's a really good question, by the way. So just now I said, to give the audience the context of Isabella's question, just now I said that public housing is the de facto welfare regime in Singapore, the main instrument of redistribution, right? So viewers may think that, oh, therefore it costs the government a lot. It is a huge fiscal burden. And this is where Isabella's question, what is the design of housing financing in Singapore? This is where why the question is so important. Remember I said earlier that beginning in the mid-60s, after 1966, the Singapore government had a very powerful tool, the Land Acquisition Act, to acquire land at pretty much at cost, at historical cost. And so the government has access to a huge land bank, which the Hong Kong government doesn't have. The Singapore government has access to a huge land bank that was mostly acquired in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that's so that it obtained those land at relatively low cost, right? Historical cost. So you add the construction cost of, say, building a public housing estate. That's the total cost to the government, right? And they don't sell it at that, right? When they sell it to citizens who are eligible, they sell it not at cost, but they sell it at a market discount. So the market price the cost might be here, the market price is here. Let's say, what is the market price? The market price will be what would be a similar resale flat in a similar estate cost. They sell it at the market price, less, so it's a market discount, but it's still above whatever the cost the government, the real cost the government incurred in building the public housing estate. So that's the genius of public housing financing in Singapore. That it is actually, despite it being the main tool of redistribution, it doesn't cost the government very much. It doesn't cost, there is no real cash outlay that is required. Why? Because the government obtained that land at very low prices historically. And when it sells those flats, it doesn't sell it at cost, it sells it at a discount to the market. So the market price of a similar flat may be 400,000 Singapore dollars. The government may sell it at 300,000 Singapore dollars, which is 1.8 million, around 1.8 million Hong Kong dollars, which is still very affordable, right? Still much cheaper than the market. So it's win-win, right? So this is the real benefit of this sort of land reform, that when you obtain the land at a historically low value, you sell it, you don't have to put out real cash, real money to cover the subsidy, and yet citizens benefit from the fact that it is much more affordable than what they would be able to get otherwise in the market. So that's on the supply side. On the demand side, citizens, you might say, why don't citizens just keep getting public housing flats? Buy, sell, buy, sell. There is a cap. the cap is informally called 2 bites of the cherry. What does 2 bites of the cherry mean? First flat, you buy from the HDB. As I said, there's a discount on the market price. And then when you upgrade to, let's say, a bigger flat, a second flat, there's also, you can still enjoy the discount on the market price. So that's what we mean by 2 bites of the cherry. Once you've already used up 2 bites of the cherry as a citizen, no more subsidy, no more public housing subsidies. So that also keeps a lid on this fiscal burden that public housing potentially might cause the Singapore state. So if you look at how much the government actually spends on public housing in any 1 year, it is, we are often surprised how low it is, right? Maybe 2 billion, 3 billion Singapore dollars, which is less than 10, which is about 10 billion Hong Kong dollars, right? 2.5 to 3 billion, about 2 billion Hong Kong dollars, about 10 billion Hong Kong dollars, which is not much by the standards of a very developed, very rich city.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Low, and thank you for Dr. Wong and Anthony for answering my question. I think I can't ask more because now we've got a lot of questions in the chat room and I need to address them right away. Let me just go to the first question, which is directing to Professor CHEUNG and Anthony. So while we look at the land, is there any problem with the people? Why don't we shorten the demand side? Long term, is there any gap in population policy and planning?
I think, of course, when we plan for planning, we must bear in mind the potential population growth and the features of the demographic structure. But experience tells us that, in fact, most of the time, the projected population growth falls behind the actual growth. So but I think somehow in planning, you have to take certain assumptions. But talking about the people factor, I think that is, of course, something relevant to the demand side, because it's not for demand. It is not just the current immediate user demand, but investment demand, and also demand sort of brought forward from the future. Because when people see prices going up, instead of waiting, people will buy now. So whether or not you're able to let people have a more relaxed expectation, that is also, should also be part of the housing policy strategy. And do we allow people to buy? That is the question that we faced some years ago when we decided to impose demand side measures, because that involves freedom. I mean, property ownership is something so crucial to Hong Kong. Market competition, open market, why government has to intervene. These are all issues that we have to deal with. And in the case of Hong Kong, somehow, because we are so used to the conventional belief that we should have a small government, we should not intervene too much. And therefore, there are tools that Hong Kong did not use in the past compared to Singapore. In terms of public housing, for example, Singapore took, in the past, had taken a very strong developer role. The government, HDB in itself, has been a major developer. But in the case of Hong Kong, somehow, until the late 70s, when the government then decided to enter the HOS market, actually it was believed that government disposed land and let the developers, they develop the land. Of course, government would try to share the profit through land premium. Now that is a more sort of reactive approach. And after the Asian financial crisis, because the property market collapsed, and therefore government in the year 2000 decided to withdraw from the HOS, the home ownership scheme market. And that lasted for quite a number of years until 2012. And also it was believed after the Asian financial crisis that somehow the demand for housing had gone down quite drastically. And therefore there was this slowdown in building more new towns. I think that is all part of the, because of the Asian financial crisis. So therefore, I think we need to take a more strategic framework in terms of envisioning what the future should be, and then whether or not the current structure, our current views remain effective in terms of delivering that future.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. So we've got one comment from the floor talking about the comprehensive plan, and it should be titled tedious plan. And then we've got the next question, which is about the possibility of the execution for these plannings. What will be the influencing factors like the public opinion, pressure, or others? So anyone?
If I can take on what this is related to what Donald has shared before, one of the crucial difficulties of the planning or the execution is actually obviously the land acquisition, is exactly what Donald said. Previously in Singapore, they just get it, the government got it at cost, close to cost. And if you were to develop Northern Metropolis or any new town development, right? So if there's no plan, the current market value is, let's say, $300 for the farmland. The public cost under the LRO, the Land Resumption Ordinance, they are now basically paying in order to establish a public purpose. They need to say that is for an NDA or public public housing, and they will have to pay about $1,300 per square feet. So that is obviously already higher than what the current market without actually any development plan. But if you were to actually factor into the future development premium, let's say people are now owning the lands, they look across in Shenzhen and say, hey, can my piece of land now is with grass, if become one day like Shenzhen across the border, then the market value will be priced in there, the expected future value. Now, so what the government is going to pay here, or here. If you pay here, obviously it doesn't work because even though it's just a current market value without plan, people are not going to accept it. And because you need a public purpose, then it's here. But even at this price, people are now potentially not happy, right? Because they're saying, hey, potential development premium is this. You're only giving me this, and so that's number one. Number two. Is that aside from landowners, you still have a lot of people that are operating on the land itself. For example, the brownfield operators, for example, the farmers, for example, the squatters, even though they don't have the land rights, they actually been living there for decades. So how do you compensate for them? Current practice is such that the landowner with legal titles actually get most of the compensation. And not a lot of compensation left for all these others that are basically occupiers for the land without the legal ownership. So I think these obviously is huge social and political discussions in the future, and that will represent an execution difficulties of any of these plans that is necessary, but is obviously very, very difficult to execute, and takes a lot of societal consensus.
I'll just quickly, Isabella, if I may, I'll just quickly add on to Stephen's point, which I think is very well put. One of the aspects of the Land Acquisition Act, which is a very powerful piece of legislation in Singapore, is that the people who are being compensated, or the landowners whose land is being acquired and who are being compensated, the compensation will not cover the increase in the value of land from future developments. So that also helps to keep the fiscal cost low. And the government's argument always has been, I think correctly, that your ownership of that piece of land is not right. You should not benefit from the future development that government is providing, because your ownership of that piece of land was inherited, right? You got it, but for whatever historical reason, why should you benefit from the future expected increase in land? So the current rule is at most you'll be compensated at the prevailing market value.
If I can add actually one more point about that. Before 97, there are a lot of court cases, discussion about what is the public purpose and the usage of the Land Resumption Ordinance in Hong Kong. But after 97, we have actually additional clause in the basic law that enshrines the private property rights for Hong Kong people. So I think that's even added to additional legal concerns about how restrictive therefore the Land Resumption Ordinance will be. So I think these are very different situations from the decades ago in Singapore.
Isabella, I fully agree with what Stephen and Donald has said about the land acquisition issues. And I think, echoing what Stephen said, I think we need to review our current land compensation schemes, because instead of prolonging the bargaining process, because that the speed also determines availability of land. So we need to be more proactive. We need to sort of go in tandem with the times. We should not get stuck too much to past assumptions. So we need to adopt more flexible approach towards releasing the land. But that said, my more realistic anticipation is that even if you improve the land compensation schemes, you're bound to face people who will bargain for more. And then once you concede to certain terms, in this case, maybe people would ask for more in another project. So this is a never-ending game, but still you need to go through the process. So that never-ending game cannot be fully avoided. And of course, the basic law guaranteed property right. And nowadays, everybody, small, ordinary people or big land developers, they can easily take judicial review. Of course, it depends on whether the court is efficient enough to deal with those reviews. And sometimes time is spent on judicial review cases.
Okay, thank you so much. And now we go to the next question, because I still see questions coming in. Does the government really understand the housing need? The Northern New Territories metropolis alone has provision for housing 2.5 million people, but the total need is only to house 1.9 million people before population decline in 2043. So 254K for those on waiting list, 226K to rehouse those in subdivided units, 615K to house those in buildings aged over 50 years, and 800K for population increase. So once the 615K in 50 plus years old buildings are rehoused, that will release space for additional housing. So any comments on this comment?
Well, I think the government knows well that land is needed, housing is very much in short supply, so we need to catch up. I think that sense of urgency is always there. I will not question that. But whether or not we are still dealing with things in the right context. In other words, we need really to look at the latest context and whether the wheels, the methods, the approach is still useful. I remember the long-term housing strategy promulgated in 2014. At that time, we said that every 10 years, we need to build, we need to have expansion equivalent to a Neo-Shartian new time. So that illustrates how much more housing that we need. Now, of course, when it comes to very specific numbers, no numbers are entirely reliable, so to speak, for a long time, because a lot of other factors will come in. But the general sense that much more housing has to be built, I think that should be should be a consensus among us.
Okay, if any other thoughts? If not, then we move on to another question. There are some options to acquire more land, but at the same time, very controversial, triggering heated debate from divided people. How can the government handle this?
Again, this is something unavoidable, because it's not just Hong Kong, but in many other cities. Singapore is slightly better, I think, because of the much stronger role, a more proactive role taken by Singapore throughout decades. But in many other cities that we have seen, they have their own unique problem. For example, I quoted in my presentation the case of the UK, the planning for the future, how they deal with the housing shortage. So a lot of housing is not just a construction process, it's not entirely a planning process, because in terms of planning, it involves choice. And choices means politics. Different stakeholders, different interests may take different views. And every society has to go through that rather complicated and sometimes tedious process of bargaining, consensus building. And if the government has more credibility, if the people are able to accept trade-off, maybe it's easier. So, but this is a process that we cannot avoid. And it's hard to say whether there is an easy way in dealing with highly divided views.
I agree.
Okay, so now this question is coming to asking on both the Hong Kong and the Singapore experience. And it is a well-known fact that politics in Hong Kong is characterized by government business collusion, which is very obvious, particularly in land and housing matters. Last year, the chief executive briefed the slap relief with developers showing signs of more willingness to collaborate with government in terms of addressing the short-term needs for housing. Could you tell us how complicated the status situations of such collusion in Hong Kong is, how difficult the position of the government is in effectively providing public housing to meet the short-term demands? What lessons can Hong Kong learn from Singapore, both having similar histories and as British colonies, but each following different trajectories in terms of housing governance? So anyone wants to?
Okay, maybe I'll try. As I said earlier, Singapore in the past quite early on adopted this developer role, which is sort of absent from Hong Kong. The government was more laid back because of the small government myth, I would say. And the government was not proactive enough in terms of treating public housing as the solution. All along, during the colonial period, this housing solution should lie with the market. I think that was the general assumption. So, and that's why even though both Hong Kong and Singapore had this so-called British legacy, the way we deal with things is so different. So it depends on what kind of strategy we adopt now. My very still crude view is that perhaps we should treat development as more housing-led. And by housing, it's not just the physical space. It has to do with quality of living, the infrastructure, and all the facilities, services surrounding housing. Now, if housing should be the priority in terms of development, or so-called housing-led development, then I think in terms of policy making or coordination, housing should be brought much closer to planning and lands. And that's why I've always thought that if government is to restructure, then housing and land should come together within one single bureau rather than divided into two. And in the case of dealing with business, if you were in business, if you were a private sector organization, you always have different views. You have your own sort of business interest to look after. And we cannot blame the private developers for pursuing interests. But then it's for government to regulate. It's for government to ensure that our society is relatively sort of equitable. So government can deal, when government deals with business, there's always the carrot and the stick. It depends on whether government is prepared to use the stick. And of course, that is not a straightforward answer because again, politics is involved and it's all a matter of choice. So I think there is room for improving the way government deals with business. And there's also space for business to respond more positively to government intentions.
If I can add just very quickly, I think as Professor CHEUNG said, it's up to the government to regulate and to provide for land. So one way to actually to break any sort of oligopolies, if there are any, of sort of land formation or developers, is that you just create more lands and increase the supply of land massively, so that you flood the housing units, particularly in public sector, so that you basically take back the control of land formation. So when I was proposing a massive reclamation, obviously there are a lot of people that disagree from all sorts of people, but one types of people that will potentially disagree of massive reclamation are people that are vested interest that has potentially land banks and stuff like that. So massively providing land in all different types is a way to solve that. And obviously, I take another question that I saw in the chat box is that, well, what about the land? What about the price of the housing? For people that already own the homes. Like what Professor CHEUNG said, it's an issue that is always there. When we're talking about land, housing units, now the government policy is changing from 60 public, 40 private in new completions into 70 and 30. So meaning that the government has already sort of increasing the public units. So the new supply will be majority public units. And so therefore, with the difficulties of executions, and therefore you're not seeing a sudden surge of private unit supply for sure in the next foreseeable years, and hopefully we can re-engineer a soft landing of prices that actually have a healthy growth, but at the same time we have be able to actually provide massive public units that can actually cut the queue very short. I think that's sort of the obviously the idealistic scenario, but either way, I think having a land bank, be able, just like the sort of the land reserve, just like the monetary reserve that we have in Hong Kong Monetary Authority, they as long as you have the reserve, then you have the mechanism to adjust the supply and demand to address any sort of gaps resulting of the elasticity of the situation. But right now, as Donald rightly pointed out, not a lot of people actually realize in Hong Kong is that the government do not have land bank in Hong Kong. And that's by creating massive land formation, that the goal is actually to create land bank for the government so that in the future, they can be more active in creating soft landing scenarios I just described. Without any land bank, they are not able to do that. So that's just my sharing.
Just to add on the Singapore experience. So besides what Stephen mentioned and what Professor CHEUNG mentioned, right? The state played the role as the lead developer. HDB was not just a housing planning agency. It was the housing developer and the biggest one in Singapore. Second, the state has a large land bank. It is the biggest landowner, right? 80% of land is owned by the state. And third, which people may not realize, even the major private developers in Singapore, most of them, or the largest ones, are government-linked companies. So, that obviously limits the extent to which they can impinge or constrain the autonomy of the state.
Okay, now we come to the next two questions. I think I'll try to squeeze them together because we are running out of time, and apparently people are really, really concerned about this issue. The two questions goes to Singapore, and which is about the Singapore's public housing policy required 2 persons is married and apply for it, which increases marriage rate, which is good. Should Hong Kong learn from it, and how Singapore government finance these public housing projects? And what does it mean to its revenue structure, since Hong Kong government depends a lot on its land sales revenue?
Yeah, those are two very good questions. Yeah, for a long time, if you were single, you couldn't buy public housing. Neither new public housing nor resale. Indeed, it was part of this idea that public housing is meant to support family formation, right? Encourage people to have children. And also, Professor CHEUNG's point, you have to ration. Right? If there's a queue, you have to prioritize. So the Singapore government for a long time said, well, we have to prioritize and give priority to married couples. Their need for a flat for home ownership is more urgent. But I think for the last 15 years or so, as Singapore has already solved its housing problems, basic housing needs, singles above, I think, 35 can now buy resale flats. Right? They can now buy resale flats. So they're not kept out of the public housing market. So remember earlier I said multiple objectives. One objective was social engineering, promoting the marriage rate, encouraging family formation. That's a kind of social engineering, but that might contradict with your other goal of giving people a source of retirement security and an asset. So yeah, so these goals do contradict, and I'm glad the participant raised it. On how public housing is financed and how the Singapore government, you are absolutely right. The Hong Kong government, I think, is far more reliant on land sale revenues. The Singapore government is not. Yes, the Singapore government earns revenues each time it leases out land, right? It earns a development premium. But if the lease is more than 9 years, that revenue it collects is locked up as past reserves. It cannot be used by the current government. It's simply locked up as past reserve. This is to deliberately tie the government's hands in terms of, right, artificially boosting its revenues in the short run. Let's say you get a government that wants to, engineer a boom, right, or want to engage in very populist redistributive programs, and it needs the revenue to do that. So the Singapore Constitution prevents the government in office from using revenue from land sales for its current operations. It's locked up as past reserves, which means the Singapore government has to find other sources of revenue. And of course, here the big difference, the huge difference between Hong Kong and Singapore is summarized in 3 words: GST, Goods and Services Tax. Singapore has a goods and services tax, which 7% going up to 8% next year and 9% the year after. That is a very important and a very durable, resilient source of revenue, which explains the big difference between Singapore and Hong Kong. Hong Kong doesn't have GST, therefore much more reliant on revenue from land sales. Singapore uses GST or has the GST. I'm not saying Hong Kong must do it or that Hong Kong should do it. Singapore is a very different context. Singaporeans can accept that we need a GST largely, and it is a critical source, is a key source of fiscal sustainability. Is a key way to ensure that the government has sufficient revenues. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we have a few more questions, so I'll try to finish them, and then we can call it a day. So the next question comes as Professor Cheung's figure shows Hong Kong's housing affordability worsened rapidly in the past 10 years. One reason is the dramatic slowdown of new town development since 2000. What are the major causes of this slowdown?
Well, I think I have actually mentioned this in my earlier response to other questions. I think that's mainly because of the Asian financial crisis. Suddenly, not just government, but the community at large seem to feel that, okay, there's no more demand for housing. I mean, funny enough, when the previous long-term housing strategy was promulgated in 1998, there was this 3-year target for public rental housing waiting time. But originally, it was envisaged that that target would not be met until well into the 2000s. But then after the Asian financial crisis, actually the target was met earlier. And then, of course, HOS first, nobody would like to buy them because of the Asian financial crisis. The housing market plummeted by almost 70%, the overall private market. So that gave people at that time, including the government, the illusion that the problem was solved already because of the economic environment. And government decided to withdraw from the HOS market in the year 2000. I think that partly explained why we have not sort of be that efficient in terms of finding land, or that we don't feel that was so urgent. But now, given the experience, I think we need to make sure that government has sufficient land bank. So one of the strategy, one of the objectives in terms of getting new land should be to ensure that at any time, government should have enough land in its own land bank.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Anthony. So we've got 2 questions. I think actually Professor Loh has addressed some of them because on the design thinking and the mechanism. But then I'll still read it out and see if there's anything that Professor Loh would want to add to supplement what he previously said. So the question goes like, I am wondering the program details emphasize the support of social welfare as mentioned, retirement security for the Singapore policy. But increases another problem of government intervention with heavy fiscal burden. How about thinking the housing policy in a holistic approach? And could you please introduce more about the mechanism and design thinking in Singapore case? And then another question, which is also related to the Singapore experience, is from the time of the Asian crisis to SARS, Hong Kong's housing prices dropped dramatically and ended up with wide social discontent. According to Professor Lowe's figures, Singapore's housing price also suffered from a similar drop at that time. Was there a similar wave of discontent on dropping property prices in Singapore? If so, how did the Singapore government manage it?
I think I answered the first question already in terms of how housing, the state, because it has this land bank and the sale price of the HDB flat, of the public housing flat, it's at a discount to the market price. So it's actually no real cash outlay or not much cash outlay on the part of the state. On the second question, yeah, in the 2000s, there was indeed, as I mentioned, housing prices were quite stagnant, both public housing as well as private housing. But I didn't sense generally that there was a wave of discontent. And I would be surprised to hear also from whether Stephen or Anthony that in Hong Kong that there was a wave of this. I think people were much more concerned about immediate issues at that time, whether it was SARS or the low growth and the lack of job creation. And as long as your house was not in negative equity, right, and as long as you could still hold down the job and you could still make your housing mortgage payments, I think people more or less understood that housing prices can be volatile sometimes, or there might be periods where they're not rising. And also, if you're a new home buyer, well, those low prices then was an opportunity. In fact, the discontent in Singapore came not in the early 2000s. It came in 2010, 2011, when housing prices were shooting up very rapidly, and people felt that they couldn't get onto the property ladder. So I don't think we should go away thinking that flat price, even in a place like Singapore, where more than 80% of people, or close to 90% of people own the flats they live in, or own the homes they live in, that when prices are not rising, people get upset. That's certainly not been the experience in Singapore. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite. When prices are spiraling out of control, that's when people get very upset. Yeah, if you're a home buyer who's looking to cash in, fantastic. But if you're looking to form a new family or start a new family or whatever, or to upgrade from your current flat, it's very unnerving to see prices spiraling beyond your reach.
Okay, thank you. So there are questions about the tenant purchase scheme, the TPS, and looking at how this the participant asked about this TPS poses many management problems, especially in a single estate mixed with both purely public rental and TPS. So he or she was asking, we may need to have a second thought to relaunch this. But then how will the future public housing engage in the sustainable development? For example, will the green building energy efficient housing be largely considered in the future housing policy?
Okay, I'll take that. As I said, the TPS management issue is well known, right? So we discussed that for a long time. And the origin of that is that you think about this, right? TPS, the sort of the mixed ownership management issue is basically you're saying, okay, the government is is selling part of it, they're owning part of it, and then they're renting it out. So some people are basically the tenants, some people basically are the landlords. So, but a mixture of tenant and landlords doesn't create a problem in Taikoo Shing, for example. Mixture of renters and tenants and landlord doesn't create problems in Singapore. The scheme doesn't seem like, and obviously it created a lot of problems in Hong Kong, and you have to ask why. And so I agree with the question that yes, we need to study what are the issues created in Hong Kong in that particular TPS scheme that is undesirable. And the question then is, how do we solve it? And so I think these are obviously administrative problems that can be solved by policies, because it was solved in Singapore, it was solved in other private sector, and so I think there are it is worthwhile to actually think about ways of enhanced TPS if we were to launch it in the future.
Let me just add that there are two ways of looking at what's behind the question. First of all, the need, or whether we should encourage public housing tenants to move into ownership homes. So they, instead of just renter, they become landlord owners. And of course, that has a lot of positive impact in terms of enhancing their assets, and also in terms of releasing the land value for the community as a whole. I think that is something that we should pursue. Now, but whether or not we should stick to the so-called TPS in Hong Kong, because the specific TPS in Hong Kong has got its own problems. Now, as Stephen said, well, we can look at it and see whether we could deal with those problems. But I think we should not get too stuck into a particular TPS model. I think the thrust should be whether we should spend more efforts to enable public housing tenants to become landlords. But whether or not by doing so will reduce the number of flats available for those still applying for public rental housing because of the lack of economic means, I think that is always a matter of trade-off. We have to balance the two demands, the two queues. Queues waiting for rental units, and the queue aspiring for home ownership. But for a number of years after the Asian financial crisis, somehow the demand, or the potential demand for HOS, was not sufficiently met. And that perhaps is one of the problems facing us afterwards.
Okay, now we have got one question directing to Dr. Wong, and which is about the marriage and divorce rate. And there's one question I think is very good in wrapping up the whole policy dialogue series for today. So the question goes about the divorced individuals. So the participant was asking about the demand of divorced individuals living in the public housing is generally higher than that in the private housing. Do you think is there any relationship between marriage divorce rate and the public housing or per capita living area? So if so, is there any solution? And then the last question, which talks about this discussion, is what seems to be missing from this discussion is the other big subject in the city, the residents who already owns homes. If there is an oversupply that causes housing prices to fall, is there a need to compensate this group? How do we need to respond to the opposition? So that brings into what Dr. Wong has been talking about, and Anthony also, about, like, if you've got, you know, you have different stakeholders who have different interests as well. So could any of the speakers address these questions, and could Dr. Wong also address the question on the marriage and the divorce rate in terms of the demand?
I think the marriage and divorce rate is a complicated phenomenon that needs to be studied thoroughly. It can be hypothesized, like the question that it may be due to insufficient living space, and therefore it created that phenomenon. But if you look at the numbers, that doesn't jive, because the private renters, actually, the living space, particularly if you look at the number of people living per unit in private renters, they are actually getting more crowded compared to renters living in public units. So the numbers doesn't jive in that story. So I think there are other social studies that needs to be done, for example, to hypothesize whether is it because of the obviously the sociological backgrounds of the marriage in the public renting units, for example, involving obviously cross-border marriages and stuff like that, and also what are the are there sort of incentive mechanism in getting public rental units, for example, so that actually that while it may not incentivize divorce, but at least give not sufficient disincentive to create that sort of mechanism. I think there are a lot of social studies that need to be done particularly in that sector that can potentially talk about sociological problems resulted of a particular mechanism in the public housing allocation, which is what I'm concerned about. But I think more studies need to be done on that.
Thank you. And then the last question about the stakeholders, those landlords, if we have oversupply, so how can we address those people's discontent?
Well, that's always part of the housing situation. And in Hong Kong's case, we are very delicate because half of the population are households, they are renters, and then half homeowners, house owners. So therefore, we cannot ignore their reaction to any policy change. And that's why I said earlier that even if we are moving towards the Singapore model, we have to bear in mind whatever measures we take that might have an impact on the private market, because the private market will show immediately, even before more public housing units are to be built. But so oversupply, of course, is not desirable. I mean, not just in housing, but in any other commodities, so to speak. We need to have stability. And I think for the housing market, stability is very important, not just in terms of not causing oversupply, but also in terms of not resulting in undersupply. So whether excessive oversupply or excessive undersupply is not desirable, we need to maintain a stable market. And therefore, some kind of forecast, longer term target is important. When the long-term housing strategy was rolled out in 2014, we gave this 10-year target so people have in mind what is being planned. But at the same time, that 10-year target is to be updated every year to make sure that we don't fall behind changing circumstances. But should there be some undersupply, or should there be any price fall due to various reasons? Because price fall never comes just because of one reason. Now, whether or not government should compensate, I don't think government can compensate that, because it's a free market, you take the risk. But for government, of course, the concern must be that it should not be insensitive to any potential factors that might result in serious oversupply.
I think one of the things we've learned since the global financial crisis, which was caused by the collapse of the housing boom, principally in the US, and also the financial overreach on the financial risks that were created by things like securitization, mortgage securitization. I think since the global financial crisis, regulators have learned that, as what Professor CHEUNG mentioned, right, house price stability is actually crucial for overall macroeconomic and financial stability. And when you let house prices spiral out of control, you create not just risk for those homeowners, but you create risks for the rest of the economy, especially if those homeowners have acquired their housing on, have become financially overextended. Right? They've taken on too much leverage, too much debt. So I think regulators around the world have come to the conclusion that you need house price or housing market stability as one of the foundations, as one of the bedrocks of overall macroeconomic stability. And I think maybe in before the 30 years, 20 years before the global financial crisis, we didn't understand that. We thought that rising house prices is a sign of a strengthening economy, a sign of people's rising incomes and wealth. So why should we do anything about that? I think policymakers and regulators have a much better and nuanced understanding that this is not something which is you can just leave to the market, and that house price affordability is desirable, not just from a social perspective in terms of helping people get into the afford housing, but also important from a macroeconomic stability perspective. Hence this idea of macroprudential regulation.
Any other comments? If not, then so thank you very much for Dr. Wong and Professor Low spending precious time joining us today for the seminar. And of course, thank you, Anthony, for hosting the Policy Dialogue series. We're coming to the end of this Policy Dialogue series. I'm really thrilled because we've got loads of questions. That means that this is a really, an issue that everybody is really concerned about. So for next, please, guys, watch out for the next one, which is about regional integration, economic future. Just want to apologize for overrunning, and also for if I can't address some of the comments here, please forgive me, because we are really running out of time. And once again, please, thank you for joining us today, and looking forward to seeing you again. That will be on March 26th. So see you.
19. It should be March 19.
Oh, March 19. Okay, sorry. So I'll see you guys on March 19. I'll be one of the participants, and that will be moderated by the HKS. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. So see you. Bye-bye.